You open your Bible and turn the page. It is the most unassumed page turn in all of literature. Your left hand holds the book of Malachi, the final prophet of the Old Testament. Your right hand touches the Gospel of Matthew, the opening of the New. It is just one thin piece of paper. You can flip it in a fraction of a second. But that one piece of paper represents 400 years of history. For centuries. To put that into perspective, 400 years ago, the Mayflower hadn't even landed at Plymouth Rock. The entire history of the United States of America fits inside that single-page turn, with more than a century left over. And for those 400 years, heaven was completely silent. There were no prophets, no new scrolls, no burning bushes, no voice crying out in the wilderness. The heavens were brass, and the silence was deafening. This era is often called the intertestamental period, or more simply, the 400 years of silence. But here's the paradox. When you finish reading Malachi, the world looks one way. The Jewish people are a small, relatively insignificant remnant living in the dusty province of Yehud, under the heavy thumb of the Persian Empire. They speak Hebrew and Aramaic. Their lives revolve around a newly rebuilt, somewhat disappointing temple. Then, you turn the page to Matthew, and suddenly, everything is different. The Persians are gone. The Greeks have come and gone. The world is ruled by Rome. People are speaking Greek. There are Roman centurions walking the streets of Jerusalem. There is a paranoid puppet king named Herod sitting on the throne. And there are these intense religious groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, arguing with each other in places called synagogues. If you don't know what happened in the silence, the New Testament almost doesn't make sense. You walk into a movie that is already halfway over, and you don't recognize any of the characters. Where did the Pharisees come from? What is a synagogue? Why is the New Testament written in Greek instead of Hebrew? Why are the Jewish people so desperate for a military Messiah? The answer to every one of those questions lies in the silence. Because while heaven was quiet, the earth was shaking. God was not speaking, but he was moving. He was actively, meticulously rearranging the geopolitical furniture of the entire known world to set the stage for one specific moment. To understand it, we have to start where the Old Testament ends. It is the late 5th century BC. The Persian Empire rules the world. They are relatively tolerant masters. They let the Jewish people return from exile. They let them rebuild their temple, and they let them worship their God. For a while, things are stable. But in the year 334 BC, a young man crosses the Hellespont from Europe into Asia, and the world is never the same. His name is Alexander the Great. He is 22 years old, brilliantly educated by the philosopher Aristotle, and driven by an insatiable ambition. The prophet Daniel had actually seen him coming hundreds of years earlier. In Daniel chapter 8, Daniel sees a vision of a ram with 2 horns, representing the Medo-Persian Empire. And then, a male goat with a prominent horn between its eyes comes from the west, crossing the earth without even touching the ground. It smashes the ram to pieces. That goat was Alexander. He moved with a speed that the ancient world had never seen. In just 10 years, he conquered everything from Greece to Egypt, all the way to the borders of India. He didn't just defeat the Persian Empire, he swallowed it whole. But Alexander didn't just want to conquer the world militarily. He wanted to convert it culturally. He believed that Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek architecture, and above all, the Greek language, was the pinnacle of human achievement. This process of making everything Greek is called Hellenization, from the Greek word Hellas, meaning Greece. Everywhere Alexander went, he planted Greek cities. He built gymnasiums. He introduced Greek theater. And he forced the Greek language, specifically a common street version of it called Koine Greek, onto the conquered peoples. Why does this matter to your Bible? Because for the first time in human history, the entire known world shared a single, common language. Koine Greek became the English of the ancient world. You could travel from Italy to Egypt to Syria, and you could communicate. The linguistic barriers that had divided humanity since the Tower of Babel were suddenly dismantled. God was laying down the communication infrastructure for a message that needed to go to the ends of the earth. Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. He had conquered the world, but he couldn't conquer a fever. With no clear heir, his massive empire fractured. It was divided among his 4 top generals. But for the Jewish people living in Judea, only 2 of those generals mattered. To the south, in Egypt, a general named Ptolemy established the Ptolemaic dynasty. To the north, in Syria, a general named Seleucus established the Seleucid dynasty. And caught right in the middle, sitting directly on the land bridge between these two massive rival empires, was a tiny piece of real estate called Judea. For the next century and a half, the Jewish people would be the rope in a geopolitical tug-of-war. Initially, the Ptolemies in Egypt controlled Judea, and for about 100 years, things were surprisingly peaceful. The Ptolemies were tolerant. They just wanted their taxes paid. During this time, a massive community of Jewish people settled in Alexandria, Egypt. They lived there for generations. They adopted Greek customs. And crucially, they started speaking Greek instead of Hebrew. Within a few generations, many Jewish people living outside of Judea could no longer read their own scriptures. The Hebrew language was being lost. So, in the 3rd century BC, the Egyptian king Ptolemy Philadelphus commissioned a project. According to tradition, 72 Jewish scholars were brought to Alexandria to translate the entire Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. This translation became known as the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70. It is often abbreviated with the Roman numerals LXX. The creation of the Septuagint is one of the most important events in biblical history. Suddenly, the scriptures of Israel were no longer locked inside a localized, ancient Semitic language. They were translated into the universal language of the empire. The pagan world could now read the prophecies of Isaiah. The Greek philosophers could now read the creation account of Genesis. When you read the New Testament and you see Paul or Peter quoting the Old Testament, the vast majority of the time, they're quoting directly from the Greek Septuagint. The silence was producing the very Bible the early church would carry into the world. But the peace didn't last. In the year 198 BC, the Northern Empire, the Seleucids, finally defeated the Ptolemies and took control of Judea. And everything changed. The Seleucid kings were not tolerant. They were aggressive Hellenizers. They looked at the Jewish people with their strange Sabbath rest, their dietary laws, and their invisible God, and they saw a threat to imperial unity. This cultural pressure reached its boiling point under a Seleucid king named Antiochus IV. He was a megalomaniac. He added the title Epiphanes to his name, which means God manifest. He believed he was Zeus in human flesh. Behind his back, the people called him Epimanes, the madman. Antiochus Epiphanes decided that the only way to unify his empire was to eradicate the Jewish religion entirely. He outlawed the Sabbath. He outlawed circumcision under penalty of death. He ordered all copies of the Torah to be found and burned. And then, in the year 167 BC, he committed the ultimate atrocity. He marched his army into Jerusalem. He entered the temple. He erected a statue of the Greek god Zeus directly inside the Holy of Holies. And on the sacred altar of God, where the unblemished lambs of the Passover were meant to be sacrificed, Antiochus slaughtered a pig. It was an act of calculated, unspeakable desecration. The Jewish people called it the abomination of desolation. The temple was shut down. The sacrifices stopped. The silence of God had never felt so heavy, so punishing, so absolute. For a moment, it looked like the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was going to be wiped off the face of the earth. But Antiochus pushed too hard, and he broke the silence. The breaking point happened in a small village called Modian, northwest of Jerusalem. A Syrian official arrived in the town, built a pagan altar, and demanded that the local priest, an old man named Mattathias, step forward and offer a sacrifice to a Greek god. Mattathias refused, but another Jewish man, intimidated by the soldiers, stepped forward to do it. Mattathias was so consumed with zeal for the holiness of God that he drew a sword, killed the compromising Jewish man, killed the Syrian official, tore down the altar, and cried out to the village, "Whoever is zealous for the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me." Mattathias and his 5 sons fled into the Judean wilderness, and a rebellion began. It was an impossible fight, a band of untrained, unequipped Jewish priests fighting a guerrilla war against the most powerful, heavily armored professional army in the Middle East. But Mattathias had a son named Judas, and Judas was a military genius. His tactics were so fierce, so striking, that he earned a nickname, Judas Maccabeus. The word Maccabee comes from the Hebrew word for hammer. Judas the hammer. For 3 years, the hammer waged a relentless, bloody campaign against the Seleucid forces. Against all military logic, against impossible odds, the Maccabees won. They routed the Syrian armies. They drove them out of Jerusalem. In the year 164 BC, Judas Maccabeus and his men walked back into the Temple Mount. They found the gates burned, the courts overgrown with weeds, the altar defiled. They wept. Then they went to work. They tore down the desecrated altar. They built a new one. They scrubbed the stone floors. They crafted new holy vessels. In exactly 3 years to the day after Antiochus had desecrated it, the Maccabees rededicated the temple to the Lord. The Hebrew word for dedication is Hanukkah. According to tradition, when they went to light the great menorah in the holy place, they found only one small jar of uncontaminated olive oil, just enough to keep the flames burning for one single day. But miraculously, that one day's supply of oil burned for 8 full days, giving them time to press and consecrate new oil. That is why, to this day, the Jewish people celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, the festival of lights. It isn't just an alternative to Christmas. It is a memorial of the moment when a handful of faithful men refused to let the light of God's covenant be extinguished in the dark. You feel like Judea, caught in a tug-of-war between forces you cannot control. The temptation in the silence is to believe the lie that God has left the room, that he has closed the book and walked away. But the 400 years between the Testaments stand as a permanent historical witness that God's silence is not God's absence. Just because you cannot hear his voice does not mean you are not in his hands. While Israel was waiting, God was building the roads. While Israel was mourning, God was preparing the language. He was arranging the geopolitical landscape of the entire planet to prepare for the moment of their deliverance. The silence you are experiencing right now is not evidence that the story is over. The silence is the space where the stage is being set for what comes next. The God who orchestrates the rise and fall of empires, the God who uses the ambition of a Greek king and the paranoia of a Roman ruler to prepare the way for his son, is the same God who is meticulously arranging the details of your life. He is not rushed. He is not panicked by the chaos. He is waiting for the fullness of time. If this study helped connect the Old and New Testaments for you, if it helped make sense of the silence, please subscribe. Leave a comment. Even a single word helps. Share this with someone who needs to know that God is still working in the quiet. Thank you for being here.